Hey there, everybody, and welcome to our deep dive for today. I'm Robert, and I'm joined by Linda, our expert guide for this exploration.
Hi, everyone.
Linda, you've given us a fascinating interview with Emanuel Todd to kind of unpack here, and it seems like you're particularly interested in his perspective on the state of the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah.
Specifically, you're curious about how the Russian economy seems to be holding up against sanctions, while the U.S. seems to be hitting a bit of a standstill.
Yeah.
So, Linda, what initially jumped out at you from this conversation with Todd?
Robert, what struck me the most is Todd's core argument that the U.S. is losing its grip.
Losing its grip.
Both industrially and militarily.
Okay.
He even suggests that the U.S. is having trouble keeping up with the demand for basic military supplies, like in the Ukraine conflict.
Wow.
Imagine that the U.S.
struggling
to produce enough ammunition and missiles.
Yeah.
It really makes you question the narrative of American dominance, doesn't it?
It definitely challenges the image we often have of the U.S. as this unstoppable military force.
Right.
But what's fascinating is that Todd connects this to internal factors within the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about a decline in education and a fading Protestant work ethic.
Right. He seems to believe that these internal shifts are eroding the very foundation of American power. And what's even more interesting is how he contrasts this with what he sees happening in other parts of the world.
Okay.
Todd points out that outside the Western bubble, many see the U.S. in decline.
Okay.
And Russia's ability to withstand the sanctions as a surprising turn of events.
Interesting.
He even mentions the BRICS nations.
BRICS nations.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Right.
And how they're looking at this situation with a completely different lens than the West.
That's a really crucial point, Linda.
Yeah.
It reminds us that there's always more than one perspective on global events.
Absolutely.
So if the BRICS nations see this as a sign of U.S. decline, are they then viewing Russia as the rising power?
It's not so much about one replacing the other, Robert.
Okay.
It's more about a shift in the balance of power.
Got it.
Todd seems to suggest that the West, particularly the U.S., is so focused on pushing its own set of values,
Okay.
especially social values, that it's alienating other parts of the world.
Right.
And this, in turn, creates opportunities for countries like Russia to strengthen their alliances and partnerships outside the Western sphere.
So it's almost like the U.S. is inadvertently pushing other nations away with its focus on promoting a particular set of values.
Yeah.
It's interesting because Todd even brings up Elon Musk and his very public criticisms of European leaders as an example of this cultural clash.
Todd suggests that Musk's outspokenness, particularly his jabs at Germany and the UK, reflects a deeper American sentiment.
Yeah.
Remember when Musk criticized Germany's energy policies or his public disagreements with British officials?
Them too.
Todd sees this as a symptom of a broader disconnect between the U.S. and its traditional allies.
Linda, what I'm gathering here is that Todd sees this difference in values or perhaps a perceived arrogance on the part of the U.S. as a key factor in its decline on the global stage.
It's certainly one of the threads he weaves throughout this interview.
Okay.
And it ties into another point that Todd makes about what he calls gender-fluid American foreign policy.
Now, that's a phrase I wasn't expecting.
Yeah.
What exactly does he mean by that, Linda?
Todd is referring to the inconsistency of U.S. actions on the world stage.
Okay.
One president signs a treaty, the next one scraps it.
Yeah.
This back and forth, according to Todd, has created distrust among countries like Russia who see the U.S. as an unreliable partner.
This idea of a gender-fluid foreign policy is certainly provocative.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, Linda, how much of this perceived U.S. decline is about actual economic or military weakness, and how much is about perception and the way the U.S. is choosing to engage with the rest of the world?
That's a great question, Robert, and I think it's at the heart of what Todd is trying to get at. He's not just saying the U.S. is weaker. He's arguing that its actions and attitudes are pushing the world in a different direction.
And this brings us back to our initial focus, the Russian economy and how it's weathering the sanctions.
Right.
If the U.S. is alienating potential allies and making itself appear unreliable, is this creating an opening for Russia to step in and forge new partnerships?
It's certainly a possibility.
Yeah.
And Todd highlights Germany as a potential wild card in this whole scenario.
Germany.
Yeah.
Why Germany, Linda?
Because of its industrial power.
Okay.
Todd argues that if Germany were to fully commit to the conflict in Ukraine, it could pose a significant threat to Russia. But it could also trigger a dangerous escalation.
That sounds ominous.
Yeah.
What kind of escalation is he talking about?
Todd believes that if Germany goes all in, Russia might resort to using tactical nuclear weapons.
Wow.
It's a chilling thought, but it highlights the high stakes involved in this conflict and the potential consequences of Germany's decisions. But what's really fascinating is how Todd ties all of this back to cultural and societal factors.
You were talking about his analysis of family structures and how they influence societies, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
He compares patrilineal and nuclear family structures,
Right.
suggesting that the decline of the nuclear family in the West might be connected to a sense of societal breakdown and nihilism.
Hmm.
It's a complex idea, but I think it speaks to his belief that these deeper cultural shifts are playing a role in the reshaping of the global order.
Oh. Okay, Linda, I'm definitely feeling the need to unpack all of this a bit further. So much to consider here.
Yeah.
Before we get too deep into these cultural and societal trends, let's take a moment to really dig into this idea of the Russian economy's resilience against sanctions.
Okay.
What's the secret sauce here?
Well, that's where Todd's analysis gets even more intriguing, he suggests.
Wait, hold that thought, Linda. This is a perfect spot for us to take a quick break and give our listener a moment to process all of this. When we come back, we'll delve deeper into the Russian economy's surprising strength. Stay tuned.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
You know, Robert, one thing that really stood out to me is how differently the sanctions against Russia are perceived within the West versus the rest of the world. Todd seems to suggest that the Western media might be overstating their impact.
That's a fascinating point, Linda. We're constantly bombarded with headlines about how these sanctions are crippling the Russian economy. But you're saying Todd doesn't see it that way.
Not entirely. He acknowledges that they've had some effect, but he argues that Russia has been able to mitigate the damage. He points to Russia's strengthening ties with other nations, especially within the BRICS bloc. He even talks about a sense of solidarity among these countries who see Russia's resistance to Western pressure as a win.
It's like the West is in an echo chamber, convinced of the sanctions' effectiveness, while the rest of the world sees a different reality unfolding. Does Todd offer any specifics on how Russia is managing to stay afloat?
Yes, Robert. He highlights how Russia is pivoting away from Western trade and forging stronger economic partnerships with non-Western nations. He suggests that Russia is finding new markets for its resources and products, essentially sidestepping the impact of the sanctions.
So in a way, the West's attempt to isolate Russia is actually pushing it towards closer collaboration with other powerful nations who are already skeptical of Western dominance.
Exactly, Robert. And this is where Todd's analysis gets really interesting. He argues that these sanctions, while intended to weaken Russia, might actually be backfiring by accelerating the decline of the West.
It's a pretty bold claim, Linda. How does he support that?
Todd suggests that by pushing Russia away, the West is essentially forcing it to become more self-reliant and to seek out alternative economic and political alliances. He believes this is contributing to a shift in the global balance of power, one that doesn't favor the West.
Okay, so let me get this straight. Todd's argument is that the sanctions, instead of weakening Russia, are actually making it stronger by forcing it to innovate and diversify its economic relationships. And this, in turn, is contributing to a broader decline of Western influence on the world stage. Is that a fair summary, Linda?
You've got it, Robert. And it's important to remember that this isn't just about economics. Todd ties all of this back to his broader points about cultural and societal shifts.
You're referring to his analysis of family structures, right? This idea of patrilineal versus nuclear families.
Yes, Robert Todd suggests that societies with stronger patrilineal traditions, where family lineage and interconnectedness are highly valued, might be better equipped to navigate the challenges of a changing world. He contrasts this with what he sees as the decline of the nuclear family in the West, which he links to societal breakdown and a loss of shared values. It's a complex concept, but essentially he's saying that strong family ties and a sense of collective responsibility might provide a kind of resilience that the West is lacking.
So it's almost like he's suggesting that Russia, with its traditional values and strong family structures, is better positioned to weather the storms of global change than the individualistic, fragmented societies of the West.
That's a really interesting interpretation, Robert, and it raises a crucial question for our listener. Todd's analysis is centered on a potential decline in the West, but what does this mean for the average person? How could this potential shift in global power impact our lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's all well and good to talk about abstract geopolitical trends, but what does it mean for our jobs, our finances, our communities?
That's where I think Todd's insights can be so valuable. He's challenging us to think about the world in a new way, to question our assumptions about the West's dominance. We've grown so accustomed to this idea of American exceptionalism, and Todd is asking us to consider the possibility that this era might be coming to an end.
It's almost like he's saying, wake up, folks, the world is changing whether you're paying attention or not.
Exactly. And by understanding these changes, by recognizing these shifts in power, we can start to anticipate the challenges and opportunities that might lie ahead. Todd's analysis isn't about doom and gloom. It's about empowering us to navigate a world in flux.
So how do we do that? How do we prepare for a future where the West might not be calling all the shots?
Well, first and foremost, I think it starts with being informed. We need to seek out diverse perspectives to get outside of the Western echo chamber and listen to voices from other parts of the world. We need to understand how other countries are viewing the situation, what their goals and aspirations are.
That's a great point, Linda. And it connects back to something you mentioned earlier about the BRICS nations and how they're interpreting the situation in Ukraine. They see the West's actions as a sign of weakness, while Russia's resilience is seen as a strength.
Right. And this is where Todd's analysis can help us understand those perspectives. He's not just presenting his own opinions, he's drawing on his deep knowledge of history, demographics, and cultural trends to offer a more nuanced view of the world. He's encouraging us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to be open to the possibility that the future might look very different from the past.
And perhaps to be a bit more humble in our approach to global affairs. Todd seems to suggest that the West's insistence on imposing its values and systems on the rest of the world is contributing to its decline.
Absolutely, Robert. He's highlighting the importance of respecting other cultures and perspectives, of recognizing that there are multiple ways of organizing societies and managing economies.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking, Linda.
Yeah.
But I want to bring us back to our listeners' initial curiosity. We've talked a lot about broad global trends and cultural shifts, but let's get more specific about the Russian economy and its surprising resilience.
That's a great point, Robert. We've laid the groundwork by understanding the broader context of Todd's analysis, but now it's time to delve deeper into the specifics of the Russian economy.
I'm curious to hear more about the mechanisms that Russia is using to withstand these sanctions. Does Todd offer any insights into that?
He certainly does, Robert. And this is where things get even more interesting. Todd suggests that Russia is adapting and innovating in ways that many in the West didn't anticipate. He points to the fact that Russia has been able to secure alternative markets for its energy exports, mitigating the impact of Western sanctions.
That makes sense. Linda, Russia has vast natural resources.
Yeah.
And they've clearly found willing buyers elsewhere in the world.
Exactly. And Todd also highlights Russia's efforts to strengthen its domestic industries.
Okay.
He suggests that the sanctions have, in a way, forced Russia to become more self-sufficient, which could ultimately benefit them in the long run.
So while the sanctions might be causing some short-term pain, they're also potentially pushing Russia towards a more sustainable and independent economic model.
That's what Todd seems to be suggesting. And he goes even further, arguing that this economic resilience is tied to Russia's cultural and societal values.
Interesting.
He points to the strong sense of national identity and the willingness to endure hardship for the sake of the collective good.
Yeah.
He contrasts this with what he sees as a more individualistic and consumer-driven culture in the West.
So he's suggesting that Russia's cultural values might actually be an asset in this economic battle. That's a pretty unconventional perspective.
It is, Robert, and it's one of the things that makes Todd's analysis so compelling.
Yeah.
He's forcing us to look beyond the surface to consider factors that we might not typically associate with economics.
Okay, Linda, I'm trying to put all of this together.
Yeah.
So we have Russia adapting economically, finding new markets, and potentially even strengthening its domestic industries as a result of the sanctions.
Right.
And Todd's suggesting that this resilience is at least in part due to Russia's cultural values and a sense of national unity. Is that about right?
You've got it, Robert. And remember, this all ties back to Todd's broader argument about the decline of the West. He's suggesting that the West's focus on individualism, consumerism, and the pursuit of short-term profits might actually be a liability in a world that's becoming increasingly volatile and unpredictable.
So what does this all mean for our listener? What are the key takeaways from Todd's analysis?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that we need to be prepared for a world where the West might not be the dominant force it once was. We need to be open to different perspectives to understand how other cultures and societies are navigating these global changes. And perhaps most importantly, we need to think critically about our own values and priorities.
Okay.
Are we too focused on individual gain at the expense of the collective good? Are we losing sight of the things that truly matter? Community, family, a sense of shared purpose. These are the questions that Todd's analysis compels us to ask.
Those are some powerful questions, Linda. And I think they're essential for anyone who wants to understand the world we're living in and the challenges we face.
Absolutely. Robert Todd's analysis is a call to action, It's an invitation to engage with the world in a more thoughtful and informed way.
And to our listener, we want to hear from you what resonated with you most from Todd's perspective. Do you agree with his assessment of the West's decline? What do you think the future holds? Share your thoughts with us and let's continue this conversation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.